Okay, so welcome back to Lesson 11. This is Administering Windows 7. This is part 4 of a 4-part series. And in previous segments, we've talked about everything from establishing a troubleshooting strategy to troubleshooting startup issues, and even talked about some of the tools that are available for troubleshooting, including a brief review of several of the tools available in prior chapters, as well as the remote access tools that we discussed in this chapter. Today we're going to talk a little bit about BranchCache, and we're going to also talk a little bit about being able to do backups and restores on local systems. Let's get started. Okay, so before we actually talk about BranchCache, we need to talk a little bit about caching in general. And we've mentioned caching throughout the semester. In particular, we talked about caching as far as what the RAM does in the computer system. So what exactly is caching? Well, simply put, caching is the process in which computers copy frequently used data into an intermediate storage medium, so it can satisfy subsequent requests for that very same data. This is typically quicker and less expensive. That's why we have caching. Now, BranchCache basically takes this to a new extreme, and BranchCache is a new feature in Windows 7 and through Windows Server 2008 R2, and it basically enables networks with computers at remote locations to conserve bandwidth simply by storing frequently accessed files on their local machines. Now, in order to use BranchCache, you do have to have a server running Windows Server 2008 R2 or above at the home office where those files are going to be originating from, and at the remote office you can have a Windows Server 2008 R2, or at very least you have to have Windows 7 boxes available at the branch office. Now, the whole point of branch caching is to allow for the storage of files on remote systems so that it doesn't have to go through the WAN each and every time. WANs are more expensive. They tend to be slower, even in today's standards, than LANs are. So every time that you can save bandwidth on the WAN, you're basically also improving productivity. BranchCache can be actually run in two operational modes, the first of which is called Distributed Cache Mode, and in this mode Windows 7 workstations at the branch office is responsible for caching each of the data that it has requested on its own machines. Now once it's cached that data on its own machines, it can then share it to all the other machines there at the branch office. The other option, of course, is Hosted Cache Mode. Works very similarly, except that when it comes time to cache that data, it will actually take that data and cache it on a dedicated content server at the branch office. And then all the workstations will go to that content server to actually pull the actual file from. Now, there's actually a process in how this works. It's basically a 7-step process on how the communications for BranchCache effectively distributes these files. First and foremost, you must understand that BranchCache does support a variety of protocols, including SMB, which is Server Message Blocks. This is basically the standard Windows file sharing protocol. And then it also supports Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, which is basically the standard web protocol, and then Background Intelligent Transfer Service, or BITS. This is the same way that data is transferred through, say, Windows Update and the like. So, how does this work? Well, first of all, the branch office workstation needing the file makes a request from the content server at the corporate office, presumably, and identifies itself as a BranchCache client. Now, when it identifies itself as such, the server will respond not with the actual file, but with the metadata file instead. Now, the metadata is going to be much, much smaller than the requested file, and therefore it's going to reduce the amount of WAN bandwidth consumed. Now, why does it give it this file? Well, the client uses this metadata file to check all the other systems at the remote station to determine whether or not there is a file of similar nature located on those systems. And the only response it's going to get back, typically in a distributed mode anyway, is if there is a file available. If there is a file available through the branch office, then it's going to ask for that file there. However, if there's no file available, if it does not get a response back, then the client will send a non-BranchCache request back to that server, and the server will then respond by giving it that file. Once that workstation gets that file, then depending on whether it's in distributed mode or hosted mode, it will either cache that file on its own machine for use and for sharing by the other machines, or in the hosted mode, it will take that file and it will parse it out to the content server responsible at that home branch office for storing that file. Now, the book doesn't discuss any security concerns with regard to branch caching, but I think we do need to touch on that because ultimately, particularly in an organizational environment, you're going to have sensitive data out there. And you might want to think about, is branch caching good with sensitive data? Well, my argument would be that you need to think long and hard about turning on branch caching in an environment where sensitive data may get exchanged in this manner. Why? Because in general, you want to keep sensitive data somewhere where you can lock it down, where you can protect it, and where you can audit it effectively. Now, can you really do that if that sensitive data has been parsed out to dozens or hundreds of systems throughout your network? Is that really worth the savings in bandwidth? So these are questions that you will have to ask as a network administrator because security is very, very important. Now, while we're on the topic of security, let's move on to using backups and restores. We talk about security a lot. We talk about in the realm of being able to protect data from unwanted access. But in reality, there's a lot more to security than that. Security is also about being able to protect the data itself, not only from harm from people going in and accessing it that shouldn't be, or destroying it that shouldn't be, but data can get corrupted on its own, either accidentally or through intentional methods, or it can get lost. You have to have a way to protect this data and be able to restore this data. That's part of being a good security steward. And for larger systems, this is something that usually is a well thought out process. You usually have a dedicated device or a system in place that will actually pull this data, all the relevant and critical data aside. It will store it in a organized manner, and it will distribute it where it needs to be distributed. But there's actually tools available in Windows 7 for the single user or for people with a small network that will allow you to do backups and restores. Now, one of those tools is the backup and restore feature. It is a wizard-based restore feature. It enables users to easily set up repeating regimen of backup jobs. And how do you get to that? Well, you go into the control panel under System and Security and Backup and Restore. Once you launch that, then the Backup and Restore window will open. Now, Backup and Restore creates a backup of files and folders to the network share, DVD, CD, or other hard disk. And all these options are available in all editions of Windows with the exception of network locations. Network locations, in order to back up to a network location, you have to be running Windows 7 Professional, Enterprise, or Ultimate. Now, that being said, these methods do create a backup of the entire drive using an image-based utility called Image Backup if you so choose. So you have two options. You can back up a series of files and folders, or you can actually back up the entire drive with this image-based utility. Lastly, you can use both of these methods to restore files and folders that were previously backed up as long as you have a backup copy. So how does it work? Well, once you go into the backup and restore, one of the first things it's going to ask you is where do you want to save this backup? And as I said before, you have several options to choose from: internal hard disk, external hard disk, DVD-ROMs, CD-ROMs, even USB flash drives. And of course, you have those network locations that are available too if you're running Professional, Enterprise, or Ultimate. Once you've decided where you want to save that data, then you're going to also have to choose some other backup settings. You're going to have to choose what do you want to have backed up. Well, you have two options. You can let Windows choose those recommended backup files and libraries, or you can choose them on your own through the custom method. Maybe you have a series of folders that you want to have backed up on a regular basis that Windows may not be considering. Now, once you've decided what you want to have backed up, then you need to figure out when you want to have it backed up, and you can do that through the change schedule mode. And you have several options there. You can choose how often, whether weekly, monthly, etc. you want to have this data backed up. You can even choose what day and even what time you want that backup to start. Now, it's important to note that the way this backup process works for files and folders anyways is that it runs that full backup, and then from that point onward it's going to run incremental backups. Now, incremental backups are the type of job that only backs up files that have changed since the last backup was performed. Therefore, Since Windows Backup is designed for use of the random access storage devices, it will always provide the latest version of every file when performing a restore, unless you specifically select an older version. Okay, so just bear in mind how that process works. Now, creating a system image backup is slightly different. As we've mentioned earlier, you can't use that file and folder backup capability in the backup and restore panel to protect the entire system. Even if you choose to use the custom options, you cannot select operating system files as those in the window folder, for instance. So in order to back up the entire disk, you're going to have to perform a system image backup, which is a separate backup of the computer system disk and that the reserved partition for Windows 7 creates on a disk during installation. Now, unlike the file and folder backup utility, which simply copies files to a compressed archive, this system image backup saves the entire block of selected targets to a virtual hard disk, or VHD, and we've talked about VHDs in a limited fashion in earlier chapters. Now, in order to perform a system image backup, you will probably have to go into the System and Security Backup and Restore panel once again, but this time you're going to create a system image. And when you do that, it's going to ask you, where do you want to save this backup? And once you select the destination options in the device you want to save the backup, you click Next, you confirm the backup settings, and you start the backup job. Likewise, another option available to you is creating a system repair disk. Why is a system repair disk a good idea? Well, the panel can create a system repair disk, which will enable you to access system recovery options if you do not have a Windows 7 installation disk or the recovery partition available to you. And in order to create that repair disk, you will simply go back into that backup and restore panel again, and this time you would choose create a system repair disk. Once you create that disk, you keep the disk handy in case you ever need it. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about what we have talked about in this chapter. Well, it's important, of course, to have troubleshooting procedures available to you at all times so that you can diagnose and troubleshoot systems. And by having a consistent troubleshooting method, you are going to have more success at successfully troubleshooting Windows 7 issues. Some of the tools that are available for troubleshooting those issues include remote assistance tools. And remote assistance, of course, is a feature that enables an administrator, trainer, or desktop technician at one location to connect to a distant user's computer. It improves productivity and is a very, very useful function. Remote desktop is the administrative feature of remote access that will enable users to access computers from remote locations. There's no interaction required at the remote site, and using it is just like sitting at the computer if you were back at the office. Now, Windows RE contains a set of troubleshooting tools to repair Windows 7, and BranchCache is a new feature in Windows 7 that requires Windows Server 2008 R2 to work with it in concert, that will enable networks with computers at remote locations to conserve bandwidth by storing frequently accessed files in the local drives, bearing in mind that there are some security issues that you may want to address if you choose to use BranchCache.